Hello, dear friends and adventurers. It's Rob, the D&D wannabe, here with some exciting news. This podcast is now made possible in partnership with our good friends at Misty Mountain Gaming. Veteran-owned and operated, Misty Mountain is one of the largest dice companies in the world. They offer the widest selection of metal, gemstone, and glass dice combined. For yourself, that special role player in your life, or your favorite podcast hosts. Just saying. Look for their booth at your next local comic, anime, or gaming convention, or find their products at mistymountaingaming.com. Okay, on with the show.
Once upon a midnight dreary, I was pondering that rather faded cliché, "The devil made me do it." How that tired old phrase has been used in infinite variations to explain some cruel and irrational and benign human beings. The fear of possession by some brutal and savage demon lurks there in the shadowed cavern of our minds, along with other dreads. Fear of the dark, fear of solitude, fear of death. I imagine they all fit within that greatest of all fears, the fear of the unknown. But then I think that in these modern times there is so little left of the unknown. Is not the dark merely the absence of light? Solitude nothing more than sanctuary away from a crowded world? And death? Well, it is inevitable. Yet there would be few among us who have not led it on a merry chase. But what of demonic possession? Can it not be understood through the science of psychology? But my musings continue, for if such things could be so easily explained away by enlightened folk such as you and I, what is it that we still fear about them? I apologize for my digression, but as you might suspect, it concerns tonight's excursion into the macabre. My thoughts have run their course for the moment. I trust I haven't frightened you away. But you see, I'm a rather rude host. Please forgive me, and welcome to Bardic Twinspiration.
Welcome, friends and adventurers, to a special episode of Bardic Twinspiration. My name is Count Steve-cula, and I am joined as always by my mindless slave, the D&D wannabe. Yes, that's very good, Rob, but remember, you must enunciate into the microphone.
Dice.
Little more. Come on, you can do it.
Dice.
I guess I'm not a dice goblin, I'm a dice zombie now, or a dice ghoul. But yes, welcome back. Another episode of Bardic Twinspiration. I don't know if that particular introduction was horrible or terrific or somewhere in between. Steve, what would you call something that's somewhere between horrible and terrific?
I assume that you mean that it was horrific.
Yeah, horrific. Horrific is right. We're coming up on Halloween at the time of recording. It'll be just past Halloween, I think, by the time that we air this. But since it's spooky season, we are thinking about horror more than we do the rest of the year. And so we decided that maybe now's the time to talk about it.
So, Let's talk a little bit about how to run a horror game in D&D 5e. Now, it might sound easier than it is. D&D 5e presents some challenges to anyone who wants to run a horror game in that system. Namely because, as has often been mentioned, D&D 5e makes some very capable adventurers. And in a lot of pop culture, when you put a hero in front of a monster, the hero usually does okay.
Right. I mean, one of the bylines for Dungeons and Dragons is kill crap, get loot.
Yeah.
That's kind of what you do. That's one of the 3 pillars of the game, is finding stuff worth killing and then acting accordingly.
Yeah, if you put something in front of your players, chances are they're going to try to fight it, whether or not you intended them to. If it has hit points, that means it can be killed, and if it can be killed, you probably have a player at your table who's going to try to.
And horror sort of suffers from the D&D mentality of aggression and heroism.
Yeah, not a lot of direct confrontation in the majority of horror movies, and in the ones that it does occur, it doesn't occur until very late in the game.
And it usually does not go well.
No, I'm thinking of Alien right now in my head, and that just was a whole bunch of not well.
I mean, look at the Friday the 13th series. People who go toe-to-toe with Jason usually don't live to regret it. And Dungeons and Dragons player characters, heroic, leveled, spellcasting, multiple attacks a turn, kind of divine smitey people, aren't people accustomed to fear, to terror, the way that we think of it, the way that we seek out and enjoy when we approach scary movies, horror literature, or frightening games.
In my experience, horror games and horror movies and horror literature, it's a lot about the main characters being out of their depth, being in over their head, being confronted with a entity or a situation that is beyond their capabilities, and having to find a way to circumvent the situation. It's a lot of getting out of dodge. It's a lot of innovating. It's a lot of hiding, where D&D 5e is a lot about confronting. In fact, D&D 5e player characters have so many tools in their arsenal to confront and to escape that it's really hard to kind of foster that feeling of hopelessness that you find in a lot of horror protagonists.
Right. I mean, the point of my favorite horror content is never to beat the thing.
Right.
It's never to kill the thing. It's always just to survive the thing. Because at the difference in your abilities, that's your best case scenario. It's either die or don't die. Or maybe stop someone else from dying. And the sacrifices that you have to make to get there. It's rarely, if ever, about gearing up for a final confrontation and hoping to solve this problem once and for all. But that is what the bulk of D&D content is about.
You know, the last bit of horror media that I consumed was actually a horror-themed RPG. And in that session, the goal was not to destroy the entity that was preying upon the heroes. It was rather to take it down with them and to make sure that whatever it was, it did not reach the rest of the colony. That the sacrifice of the player characters against this overwhelming force would keep the rest of humanity safe.
There are RPG systems out there that are designed specifically to curate the horror experience, to give you a sense of impending doom, and to really highlight the difference in danger presented by the player characters and the threats that they must face. But Dungeons and Dragons is not really one of them. It is designed for high adventure, and while it is extremely versatile and can handle a shift in tone to come down into the world of doom and gloom, it takes a little extra effort, and particularly, I think, it takes the cooperation of everybody at the table.
Right. Which is why we recommend that the first thing that you do when you're gearing up to run a horror game
is to say so.
Is to tell everyone that you are going to run a horror game.
Whether it's a movie or a video game or a book or a podcast, when you go to seek out horror media, you have to suspend your comfort a little bit. It works best when you are receptive to the kind of atmosphere and the kind of feelings that a horror game is meant to evoke.
So, let's break that down, because there's two different sides of the screen to discuss. What, as a player going into a horror-themed game, should be your first priority?
I would say attitude is probably the first thing. You want to make sure that you are coming into the game with that, as I just said, the willingness to be scared, the suspension of your bravery, with the idea that you are open to being guided and taken away by this story more so than with a normal game. Secondly, I would say, is not just you, but the character that you bring to this particular session or campaign also needs to have that same mentality. The dauntless, fearless, invincible paladin who is entirely uncomplicated and flawless is maybe not the character to bring into this particular sort of game.
One of my major considerations when making any character is going to be giving the Dungeon Master some little story beats or seeds to play with. And we're going to talk more about this in an upcoming episode, and I'm really excited for that to air. But when you're going into a horror game, like say when I made the character Voltaire for your Curse of Strahd campaign, leave some dangling flaws for the Dungeon Master to be able to prey upon. Take a thematic background or a thematic class. In that campaign, Voltaire had the Haunted One background, which is just great for a horror campaign. I mean, you literally could not ask for a better one. And then he was also a warlock, so he was already accustomed to having the voice of his patron in his head, and now he has the voice of Strahd in his head, and he is just plagued by the whispers of powerful dark entities, and those whispers preyed upon his flaws and kind of started to drive him a little crazy.
I think that's an important word there, is flaws. If you think of your favorite characters from horror media, they aren't perfect. In fact, most of them are far from it. They carry with them a dark secret, or a hidden tragedy, or a crippling addiction, or have some sort of mental trauma or illness that makes them doubt themselves. Having traits that add to the fun of this style of game, things that make them maybe less likable, but more relatable than your average D&D character. Giving them flaws, giving them vices, giving them fears that can be played upon.
Exactly. I mean, in general, nobody likes a Mary Sue. Make someone who is imperfect, but for a horror game, give them flaws which will invite fear.
Nobody wants to see a horror movie starring Captain Marvel.
Or Superman, exactly.
Right. You want Hawkeye in that situation. You want somebody who maybe already has some insecurities. A guy that has stuff to lose. A guy who is maybe intimidated by the other people around him, and who openly admits to Wanda in one of the movies that he's scared, but he still goes out and does it. He still goes and experiences the bad.
You know, if I had to pick an Avenger to be in a horror movie, though, I think I would pick Ant-Man.
Just because you'd like to see Paul Rudd in a horror movie?
I like to see Paul Rudd in any situation, but just because he has it so not together.
Yeah.
No, it's like adulting almost breaks this man. Just imagine what the interference of extraplanar entities could do.
So, I mean, every D&D character that is well made has some imperfection or vulnerability or flaw. I mean, it's there on the character sheet. Just take that and crank it up past an 11 to 12 for a horror game. And then There are themes in the classes and races and lineages and backgrounds that you could pick that would also lend themselves more to this kind of game.
Mechanically speaking, I think it would be great to have a paladin in a horror game that I was running, specifically because of their divine sense ability. Now, I know that there's probably a lot of DMs out there who think, wow, I would really hate to have a paladin use divine sense and discover the location and be able to track the monster or the evil entity. But think about being in a normal social situation. If you gave the paladin a reason to set off their divine sense and they were completely surrounded in a situation where they thought they were safe, that's a great little story beat. Also, rangers and their ability to track their favored enemies would be great for the stage of the game where they finally attempt to turn the tables and confront the enemy. Which again, I encourage you to make that pretty late in the story arc. But having a ranger who can track that thing down sounds great to me.
See, if I were playing in a horror game, I would take a different direction. I would want to play a wizard who is tagging along with the party to face the ghost ghouls and goblins, but maybe is actually there to discover the forbidden magic that caused all of these hauntings. Or an inquisitor rogue who is investigating the strange and inexplicable murders that have been taking place in the palace. Or maybe a lore bard here to finally find answers to all the questions surrounding the vanishing town.
Horror is just so rife with potential that I know that D&D 5e doesn't lend itself to a horror game, but that's no reason to avoid the genre entirely.
They're clearly giving you some content geared towards it. Not just geared towards it, but specializing in it. The Haunted One background, as you mentioned. Mm-hmm. The Reborn lineage.
Love that thing.
The entire Curse of Strahd campaign.
The best campaign.
The Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft sourcebook. They want you to play horror in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. In fact, there's a section towards the beginning of both books, Curse of Strahd and Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, that details advice on running horror games, or that outlines different genres of horror. If you have access to those books, I do strongly recommend going and having a look there, especially if you're going to be a dungeon master running those games, to get quick tips on what kind of tools to use. Though the advice there is more thematic than practical, but it is still quite useful if you're planning to indulge in a horror game in 5e.
Speaking of running a horror game, let's hop to the other side of the screen and talk about what it's like to DM a horror game. Now, the majority of this episode is going to be about how you can overcome some of these challenges and really try to create a game which is unnerving and unsettling for your players. But before we get to all that, let's do a little housekeeping. The first thing that you need to do in order to achieve that is tell everyone that's what you're trying to do. Literally, the first thing. And that is so that they can buy in. Because this needs to be a collaborative effort amongst everyone around the table if this is going to work.
Yeah, this is one of those one bad apple ruins the whole bunch sort of situations. If even one person at the table isn't sold on the idea, they can kind of spoil it for everybody. I immediately think of two character archetypes that will kind of ruin the horror vibe for me. One is the self-styled comedian who at every opportunity, and I mean doesn't skip a single one, finds a way to make everything a joke, doesn't take anything seriously.
I feel attacked on a personal level.
In horror media, these guys exist, and they're usually the first to die.
Yep.
And that's for good reason, because you just can't set a horror mood with somebody like that around.
When you encounter one of these characters in horror media, and you do a lot, you always start to feel bad for them because you know what's going to happen. In order for the mood and the movie to progress, this casual, dismissive attitude that they have towards the entity, not taking it seriously, is going to bite them in the butt and more than likely bite off their head.
It's so bad when it's lowest common denominator humor, too. Just...
This is how it's going to go. This character is going to show up.
Ugh.
And they're going to be the comic relief. And they're going to make you feel good. They're going to be a big part of the first part of the movie before the entity starts to take its hold upon the story. And then as the entity does, they will make light of it, and they will casually confront it in order to show everyone else that it's no big deal, and then they'll die. And having that ingredient in your horror story can work out great, but it doesn't need to be coming from one of the player characters.
Right.
Because that's how you respond to that stimulus, is to kill it.
And then you have a player who set aside their evening to come and hang out with their friends, who's going to be twiddling their thumbs for the remainder of the session. So you don't want that guy. And for a very similar reason, you don't want the fearless macho Chad going in, who is so much man that the monster or the ghost or whatever danger that we're facing didn't see him coming. It's not ready for Chad. You know what I mean? This is the quarterback in the teen slasher movie who's going to go up and protect everybody because he's not taking this seriously. He's not afraid. He doesn't care. He can take it. And then he can't. And then you have a player twiddling their thumbs for the rest of the session again.
And I think that's the common denominator here, is that you want all of your player characters to take the threat seriously. They can be brave, they can be comedic, but part of the buy-in is making a character that is going to understand that what the DM is presenting you with as the horrific entity is scary, and they will be scared by it. How they respond to that, in terms of their comedic value or their personal degree of aggression, can vary, but they need to take it seriously.
And it's not just scary, it's dangerous. No good horror story starts with something that the protagonist or protagonists can handle, right? They need to go and get the big gun, or they need to go and find the grimoire, or they need to go and find the priest to set the spirit at rest, or what have you. They can't handle it on their own. And to your earlier point, if the dungeon master is going to expect that kind of behavior at a Dungeons and Dragons table, it needs to be communicated. You can't just expect that out the gate.
Speaking of things that need to be communicated when attempting to run a horror game, is the subject of things which frighten the players. So as a DM running a horror game, your goal is to make your players uncomfortable and to scare their characters.
Yes.
But what you don't necessarily want to do is legitimately terrify your players. So on the subject of subjects to be broached before beginning a horror game is the concept of phobias.
We'll have a Session 0 episode soon, and we'll talk about this in a little bit greater detail, but there are lines with your players, not their characters, with your players that don't need to be crossed. Phobias are pathological fears that even the people that they affect can't entirely control or even necessarily understand. They aren't fun things to poke and prod at and that we can laugh about later. They are legitimately, mentally, and physically terrifying to people. You want to make sure of what those might be for the people at your table, and be sure to steer clear of them. Because at the end of the day, even a horror Dungeons & Dragons game is still meant to be fun.
Checklist for the DM. Disturb your players. Disgust your players. Unnerve your players. Unsettle your players. But you don't want to cross a line and hurt your players with your subject matter.
All of these things to their characters, sure.
Oh, definitely.
But your players are real people. And friends of yours who you're going to see later this week, and who you hope to have a continuing relationship with.
Player characters should expect to be scared. Player characters should expect to die in a horror game. which is one of the reasons that I think that a horror game is much better served as a 1 or 2 shot than a campaign. Horror campaigns can be very difficult to curate for a couple of reasons. One of them being that it's a very moving and terrifying moment when a character dies in a horror movie or a horror book or a horror game. And gosh, it sure would be nice if you had a little bit of that sprinkled into your game, but you don't want to have your players constantly remaking characters over the course of a campaign. But, if someone died in the 9th hour confronting an entity in a 1 or 2 shot, that'd be pretty great.
See, personally, I like the idea of a horror campaign. And you know this, I love slow builds and big payoffs. Maybe player character death isn't so much in the forefront when I'm trying to run horror, but the sacrifices that must be made, the compromises to morality, the trauma that characters undergo, and how the horror changes them as people, you just can't fit that into a one-shot.
I can see that, but I feel like you probably could fit that into maybe a 2-shot or at most a 3-shot. Trying to keep your players on edge like that for a extended period of time would become difficult for the dungeon master and kind of taxing for the players. I mean, let's face it, horror movies are usually about 2 hours long. A single D&D session is on average double that, and a 2-shot would be 4 times that long, and a campaign would be potentially 100 times that long. I feel like shrinking it down into kind of a horror bite is going to be a lot more achievable. That being said, Curse of Strahd exists, and I loved it. So it can be done, and it can be done well. It's just a lot to sign up for.
It is much more difficult, not just in terms of ease, but in terms of the effect it has on you running the game and on your players enjoying the game to do something horrific long term. And some dishes are best served as aperitifs, as hors d'oeuvres.
Or chasers, get it? Like getting chased by the monster.
I get it. So, yeah, I'm not disagreeing. I'm just saying that if you can do it right, horror campaign is chef's kiss.
The biggest reason that I think that is difficult, I haven't even covered yet, and that is the curation of hope.
Ooh.
Here's my opinion of how horror and D&D go together. Hope is the essence of an adventure. You may face a degree of adversity, but there's always a way to work around it, and there's always a way for the good guys to win. Horror is the curation of hopelessness. It's a slow and steady removal of every potential way to survive until you have a lone survivor surrounded by their fallen friends.
That is a challenge, and a challenge that you have to be willing to tackle if you are going to try and run true horror. Horror is all about the light versus the darkness, even if both the light and that darkness are in shades of gray. And good horror lives in the dark. It sinks deep into the black to where all hope is lost, or almost. If you put your players' characters in a truly hopeless situation, it's not going to affect your player characters. It's going to affect your players. If they have to move from hopeless situation to hopeless situation to hopeless situation, it's going to be very discouraging to them. They're going to stop having fun and stop showing up to the game.
Mm-hmm.
You always have to have a little light in the darkness, even if it's temporary and fleeting, or even if it's false. Take, for example, we've talked about the Curse of Strahd campaign. This isn't much of a spoiler, because if you play the game as written, you encounter this pretty dang quickly. You meet Ismark Kolyanovich and Irina Kolyana, denizens of the village of Barovia. And Irina is being plagued at night by the vampire Strahd, a fate that her brother, Ismark, wishes to save her from. He has heard of, but never been to, a town up the road called Vallaki, a place where Strahd and his minions cannot access, a place surrounded by a high wall, a place far from the watchful battlements of Castle Ravenloft. To Ismark, Vallaki is hope. If he can reach Vallaki and take his sister there, then their problems will be over. Having that sliver of hope for that character, that hopefully is spread to the characters enjoying the adventure, is very important when you are playing through a game like The Curse of Strahd, where it seems like evil has all the cards at all times. Whatever form that light of hope takes, a distant town like Vallaki, a cure to the plague, a legendary hero that could be sought out, that has faced similar problems before, perhaps a holy artifact, a legendary weapon, whatever it is, make sure that the players at least think, and sometimes are correct in assuming, that they have a solution to their problem, that there is a way out if they are resourceful enough and brave enough and persistent enough to find it.
Right. Stringing your players, and hopefully their characters, along with the promise of hope is integral in keeping them to go forward against odds that are always stacking against them. You want to give them anticipation, because anticipation means suspense. It's the withholding of a solution or the withholding of an answer that keeps them moving towards it. And it's really the bread and butter of the horror genre. Tease them with clues, with hope, with answers, and then when you satisfy one, present them with more questions. I recommend that you do this a lot at the beginning of the campaign, because that's going to give them multiple different things to look forward to and to look for, and then start answering those questions more and more the closer you get to the final confrontation, so that you can kind of narrow the direction that you want them to head, and that all roads lead to the monster.
Sure. If this were a sci-fi game instead of Dungeons and Dragons, and there's a monster aboard the ship, first you want to get to the weapons cache, and then you realize the weapons don't work. Then you think, oh, well, maybe we should get to the escape pods. This is a serious threat. And for some reason, the escape pods are locked down. You start ticking off your options, ticking through the ways to handle the situation, the different options that you have, until you have one or none left. Time to blow up the reactor.
Yes, give them lots of options. Let them try all of them. The thought that there's something that they could do to solve the problem that they haven't tested yet is what's going to keep them moving forward. Sometimes it's fun to reward them with additional ambiguity, to give them more questions instead of answers. But I think it's equally, if not more satisfying, to give them a very clear solution, the answer to what they're looking for. But then, as they go to implement it, twist the knife a little bit, change the rules, complicate that resolution. Say that the party has finally discovered the entity's weakness, and they're finally ready to confront the monster and exploit it, but you're not ready for this to end just yet. You gave them false hope. You gave them a perceived weakness, but by the time they confront the monster, it has already changed. It's already evolved. It's already grown past the point where that weakness could still be exploited. And that sends them back to square one, maybe a resource or even a player down from when they started.
I would hesitate with overusing this sort of approach, just because you can spiral into that hopelessness. But perhaps in realizing that one weakness doesn't work, perhaps you reveal another that you're just not able to take advantage of at this time. So long as the players feel like their characters are making progress, they can keep enjoying the game.
Or take the hot fuzz approach. Let them kill the monster. Give them the solution, have them confront the monster, and then let them finish it. 2 hours into the session, the player characters dust the situation off their hands and try to get back to their normal lives, and then they realize that it's all happening over again. it wasn't just one entity. It was a nest. It was a coven. Sure, they now know that they can take one of these things down, but just how many are there? And where are they hiding? It's the same problem, but you have refreshed and resurrected the sense of dread and the sense of intrigue that surrounds it. Lead them to a conclusion, to a resolution to the problem, but then complicate it somehow. It'll help you build suspense.
You use the word intrigue, and that implies to me an unanswered question, which is one of my favorite elements of horror. It's allowing things to be mysterious. The best horror monsters, to me, are the ones that you know next to nothing about, at least at the start. They are alien, they are foreign, they are supernatural, or at least they seem that way, even if they aren't actually. Giving vague clues as to the nature or the identity before the eventual reveal, if a reveal is ever coming, is one of the best ways to make your players and their characters a little uncomfortable and to keep them on their toes, wondering what's around that next corner.
To me, that's the tastiest part of the horror experience, is the uncertainty that you can breed surrounding the monster, surrounding the entity. How many are there? What is it? What can it do? What can't it do? H.P. Lovecraft is quoted as saying, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is the fear of the unknown." Make uncertainty a part of the adversary. Tease your players along with little bits of information here and there, but be careful not to completely reveal the adversary. If you show it, don't name it. If you name it, don't show it. The more uncertainty that you leave in its description, in its nature, the more that your players will have to fill in those gaps, and your players are intimately more familiar with what scares them than you are. And they will fill in those blanks with their own personal worst-case scenario.
I think an easy way to do this is to describe the creature without actually telling anyone what it is. For instance, if I were to describe a creature on all fours with coarse fur matted against its lithe form, large curved teeth hide a wide tongue, intermittently visible between snapping, slathering jaws. Its 4 feet end in hooked claws that are covered in dirt and mud, and a rope-like tail swishes behind it. Is way more exciting than saying, "You see a dog." Describing the aspects that make up a creature in great detail is much creepier than just telling.
Right. Here's the thing about revealing the bad guy. Once you give that creature form, you can never recapture the mystique that it held before you did so. A full, specific description of every aspect of it, no matter how unsettling, will never be as effective as allowing a player's mind to fill in just a few corners.
You know, this is going to date the episode, but today, the day of recording this, the 2nd season of Netflix's Lock and Key premiered.
Huh.
I actually really liked that show, and I'm very excited to see what direction they're going with it. And one of the things that really drew me into the show was Echo, a character, a creature in the first episode that was pretty dang creepy when you first met them. Bodhi, the youngest Locke child, moves to a new house, goes out to the well house, and hears a voice echoing up to him from the darkness. At this point, the creature just has a voice, and it is a sultry, feminine, resonating voice. Several minutes later into the episode, rather than preserve that mystique, they give the creature form. You see the seductive silhouette of this woman at the bottom of the well, and she has medium-length hair and a skin-tight dress, but you have no details. It's just the silhouette. And that creepiness is lessened somewhat because you have given form to the fear, but the mystery of it increases. Why is she down there? What is she doing? What is she? And what are those shadows hiding?
Right. You as a viewer, when you heard only the voice, there were limitless possibilities as to what could be making it. When they showed you that silhouette, they didn't outright say what Echo was, but they significantly limited those options.
And by the end of the first episode, they removed all my fear. They showed the face of the enemy. And, it's an attractive woman in her 20s or 30s. It's just a lady at that point. It's a lady at the bottom of the well. Don't know why she's at the bottom of the well. She clearly has some supernatural abilities. I don't know how she can do what she can do. And I still have questions that kept me invested in the story, kept me coming back, and have made me excited for season 2. But I wasn't afraid anymore. There was no horror element remaining in that show.
The Harry Potter series builds up a ton of mystique around Voldemort. People don't say his name, and yet everyone knows it. He's a sorcerer, a wizard of unrivaled power and no reservations about how to use it. And then you meet him, and he's a guy with no nose and a black robe.
Yep.
Granted, that's, I guess, creepy. I tend to like my people to have noses, and he's clearly a bad guy. But he lost a lot of that mystique.
I liked him better when he was a face coming out of the back of somebody else's head. That was creepy.
One final example is that we had a kind of a 2-shot horror break in the middle of our campaign that you're running for us, where we go into a town to find that it is being preyed upon by an entity known as the Blackguard. Almost everyone who has encountered it has not lived to tell of it. But the one or two that have describe something that moves wrong. Something that drifts unnaturally through the alleyways. Something unnaturally large, completely covered in a dark, scaly metal that moves unnaturally to prey upon its victims in the middle of the night and has no reservations about attacking lone individuals or even large groups of armed men.
Right. I wanted to indulge in a little bit of horror through the course of this campaign to let you guys know kind of what you're in for and set the tone for the weird that y'all are just starting to realize is out there. So I presented you with this serial killer, is how the local constabulary understood it. But something supernatural, something off, something almost alien about this creature. And it did move unnaturally. It was so black that it almost seemed to absorb the light around it. It had a penchant for targeting clerics and members of the clergy, so it had a type, which fit, to a certain extent, some of the members of the party, which made them uncomfortable. And before the end of the second session that we played, it had claimed the life of one of the party members who decided to go out into the city at night alone.
Losing a character makes the horror better.
So, yeah, I dabbled in a little bit of horror. And I even did this little cameo at the end of a session that we played where I described it dragging half of a body back to its lair, focusing on the alien surface of its jet black body, the strange and peculiar movements, the long slathering tongue. I had it sniff the air as though it was able to smell the arrival of the player characters and admitted to its unending hunger. And that worked. You guys were very excited for the next session, very uneasy about what this entity might be. And I continued that. I curated that into the next session where you fought a creature that almost matched the description, believing that you had found the Blackguard. only to realize that your fallen party member had become the thing that you were hunting. Once you slew it and learned her identity, you realized that the true evil was still out there, and that a similar fate could be in store for any one of you.
Losing a character makes the horror better. No, but seriously, that actually kind of goes along with a lot of what we've been saying. That was a 3 or 4 episode horror arc as we made our way through that town. It was just enough time to set up the bad guy, which you did very well in that little vignette. That was the first one you hit us with, and it was very effective. We spent the next session looking for our missing party member. The next session, we found out what had become of her. We had very temporary hope that, hey, we confronted the bad guy and we killed it. But that resolution was very quickly turned on its head when we realized, no, we didn't kill the problem. We just finished off an infected party member. So now we know we did not solve the problem, but also the problem is worse because this thing can make more of itself, and it can make more of itself out of us. And then in the next episode, we had a confrontation with it, and we killed it. But
which you weren't supposed to do. It was going to continue. I had other sessions planned. Y'all were just terribly clever and trapped it and got it kind of stuck and killed it very quickly.
Hold Person's a great spell. That very much kind of followed my ideal progression, so that's why I enjoyed that portion of our campaign. But let's move on from these examples, because I think we've adequately made our point there, to what I think is the secret to cultivating horror across any medium.
There's a secret?
Yeah, so in preparation for this episode, I watched some videos and I read some articles about what is horror and how do you make something scary, whether it's specifically in the context of D&D or not. And I didn't find the answer that I was looking for.
You let us down again, Internet.
I was left to type and think for a long time, and I am pretty sure that I have figured out what makes horror horror.
Do tell.
For me, all great forms of entertainment are about subverting expectations. And I'll cover that in detail in some other episode in the distant future if I ever remember to do it. But it's a powerful tool in multiple situations. This is why we love magicians and why surprises are so powerful. But to leverage this in order to create a horrific situation, we need to find or create something that makes a player or their character feel safe in assuming to be true, and then cast that into uncertainty or directly betray that trust. A lot of people draw assurance, draw confidence, draw safety from their home, from their bed, from
things they're familiar with, from familiarity, things that they believe they understand.
Right. Kids draw comfort from their bedroom. So one of the quickest ways to terrify a child is to imply that they are no longer safe in their own home, that they're no longer safe in their own bedroom, in their own bed, beneath their own blankets.
That would work on me, too. Screw children. That would work on me.
Exactly. It's something that we grew up with, and it's still true for us today. We feel safe in our own homes, and to imply that whatever this entity, this adversary, this monster out there is, that it can get you in your own home, betrays the safety that you draw from trust in your own home.
I would say in the context of D&D, where you're out adventuring and not always at home, players can feel at home with certain mechanics, with certain environments, with certain story structures. Subverting those expectations, breaking the norm, and getting your players and their characters to wonder what's coming next is interesting. It's worth pursuing. And systematically tearing away comfort zones can create interesting situations for your players and their characters.
Yeah, that's why things like legendary resistances out of nowhere are unsettling for me as a player. If I know that I'm gearing up for a boss battle, then I'm going to try to cast some spells to chip away at those legendary resistances. Let's go ahead and drop hold person or polymorph or banishment before we start casting the really big stuff, to make sure that those inconveniences that the BBEG would rather not deal with are the things that it uses its legendary resistance on. And then we throw in some haymakers. If you surprise your players with some legendary resistances, and when they cast the big one, it just became a horror combat.
I'm not sure that I buy into that one.
In a microcosm, you have fundamentally changed the rules of the confrontation. The subversion of expectations.
I was definitely thinking more along the lines of the player characters and their abilities, not the resistances of the monsters that you're going to face. Pulling things to make the fights harder out of your butt is something I try not to do as a dungeon master. It just seems like I'm picking on the puny players. But changing something about a player's character sheet, the thing that gives them comfort, because the monsters are always uncomfortable, strange, and bad. But you were talking about messing with things that the players feel comfortable with. If you change something on that character sheet of theirs, that will get their attention. That will make them feel that nothing is sacred. That will make them feel unsafe. That's why one of the most terrifying monsters in the monster manual to me is the shadow. Because when the shadow hits you, it lowers your strength ability score. And when ability scores start going away, whoo boy, you're in trouble. That can affect how easy it is for a character to hit with their attacks, how easy it is for them to escape grapples, how much damage they do when they hit. Modifying that many numbers just by being hit one time with one attack from one creature, who might not even be the only creature in this encounter, to Rob, the player, that's scary. Now, even though I'm recommending, which I guess I am, that you remove or alter some aspects of the character sheet, that also kind of dips its toe into what I think is one of the Dungeon Master's greatest sins, in removing things that the player characters can do, or the things that they expect to be able to do going into the game, taking those things away and telling them that they just don't work. Because there's got to be some amount of trust between the players and the Dungeon Master. But shaking the trust between the player character and the rest of their world can be pretty fun.
As I think about other horror movies and video games, some other examples include, I draw safety and comfort in the fact that children are harmless. A lot of people are terrified by spooky children. That family loves and protects you. To have this level of danger coming from someone within your own family is deeply unnerving and unsettling, and it makes you question everything that makes you feel safe. For my wife, it's the assumption that people can't float or climb backwards up walls. That's a really quick way to freak her out.
Right, because you take for granted that gravity works.
Right.
The same for everybody, all the time.
Exactly. You know, you probably don't even think about it. You never question it. You don't realize that that's a thing that you draw safety from. But then when it is drawn into question, then something breaks inside of you, and you don't know how to deal with that. And that is the discomfort that is the essence of horror.
So we're taking the familiar, the comfortable, the things that we are certain of, and then breaking that certainty.
Right.
And finding horror between the cracks. Like, one of my favorites, dolls don't move.
Things like spiders are small and can't really hurt you. That the dead don't rise again.
The dead stay dead, yeah. That your dreams aren't real and can't hurt you. Or that you are always in control of your body.
And people don't eat people. I feel like that's a thing that we can safely assume. If someone is eating people, it's definitely not people, right? They don't terrify me, but it's deeply unsettling for that topic to come up for me.
We have there's a player in our games that, you know, if you were to present them with a character in the fiction eating another person, their reaction would just be, oh, well, that's evil, and run in and try and kill it. But I think most people would rather be disturbed or frightened and want to make sure that they are not going to be on the menu next.
I don't know. I think killing people that eat people is probably a pretty safe assumption. Unless life is the Donner Party, then I think he's pretty justified in that. The ability to rely on your own five senses, or your own sense of right and wrong, or your own sense of how the world works, is one of those fundamental principles that, once again, really pays off to betray in a horror genre.
Yeah, those payoffs can be huge. Like, a lot of horror media out there will play with people being unable to trust their own senses, like you said. They hear strange and inexplicable noises. They see haunting figures in the corner of their vision, or full bore in front of them. They feel chills in the air, or hear whispers in the dark. But importantly, they're the only ones that experience this phenomena. If no one else hears those noises, hears those whispers, sees those figures, feels that chill, do you really? Is it all in your head? Are you crazy? Or are they blind to what's really out there?
Right, those hallucinations are huge, and they appear all the time in horror media. The fact that you will be looking at someone and then suddenly their appearance changes and you see the person that you're holding this conversation with warped in some evil caricature of themselves. Or perhaps you're having a conversation with someone and then all of a sudden you see your long dead friend standing in the corner of the room and they make eye contact with you, maybe even raise a glass to you, but you know that they can't be there, and yet every part of your body is telling you that they are. The inability to trust oneself calls literally everything else into question, all at once.
Anyone hoping to really play upon this particular trope, this particular lack of trust, I strongly recommend you go check out the miniseries on Netflix, The Haunting of Hill House. There is so much he said, she saw, he saw, but we didn't in that series. It is beautiful. It is masterfully done. And the show is also good. But another thing that's fun to play with is having your characters not be able to trust their memory. What they think happened may not have happened. There's evidence to the contrary. They're losing time, forgetting where they were for hours, maybe days, weeks. They have amnesia and don't remember where they came from. Or maybe strangers come into their life that they don't know from Adam, but that are intimately familiar with them as a person and their history. And they're right. Removing that trust of your own memories, your own mind, is not safe. Ooh, that's fun. And I know this is particularly targeting at you because I'm doing that to your character right now, and I'm really enjoying it.
You know what I look forward to someday is being a DM where all of my player characters have unwittingly been the victim of modify memory. It doesn't even have to be a horror campaign. Every character will experience something that they do not understand is not true. You're making a lot of hand gestures. This is going on in someone's game, isn't it? Is it our game?
Have you seen I'm talking about more series on Netflix. Mm-hmm. Have you seen The Hollow?
No.
Okay, it's a little animated cartoon.
I'm a dad of 3. Really? My experience with Netflix is predominantly allocated to Word Party and recently My Little Pony, Sophia the First, oh my god, Coco Melon. Thank goodness I finally got the kids to watch some Whack Fu, because I can tolerate me some Whack Fu. That's a decent show.
Okay.
Yes, tell me about Hollow.
Seriously, though, find some time for The Hollow. The first episode opens with 3 kids in a white room with a typewriter in the middle of the room, and they can't even remember their own names. And then they have to get out, find out what's going on in this crazy world that's completely inexplicable, and it is amazing. It is, oh man, so many D&D games I wanted to run after watching The Hollow. And there's 2 seasons out. 2 seasons!
You know, I don't know if this is a big and telling confession, but I don't have a lot of experience with horror. It's not something that I go and seek out, although it is something that I enjoy, but I haven't watched a ton of horror movies. I've watched all the Saws, I've watched Scream, I've watched The Grudge, some various exorcism movies. I'd say, probably more than, my wife, probably in the 2 to 3 dozen range out of the hundreds of horror movies that exist, but I'm not exactly an aficionado. But you know what I do like? Thrillers.
I will say that The Hollow is not a horror show. You could watch it with a family, but please continue.
Thrillers, psychological thrillers and things like that, they are great. And messing with someone's memory or with their ability to trust themselves or their ability to trust their surroundings is exactly what thrillers are made of. And they're so closely tied to horror. Like, what makes a thriller good is what makes a horror good. Just, with more jump scares and supernatural things.
On the subject of genres and films that we really enjoy, and while on the concept of being incapable of trusting what's around you, I really love the 1982 movie The Thing.
Ooh, yes.
Taking and violently ripping from you your ability to trust the people around you who are supposed to be helping you get out of this situation.
Yes. The distrust of oneself is what makes a great psychological thriller. The mistrust of everyone but oneself is what makes a great any other kind of thriller. And my favorite thrillers are ones like The Thing, where there is a hidden traitor somewhere within the group. This is why social deduction games are great. This is why Among Us became so ridiculously popular last year. This is why my second favorite board game of all time is Dead of Winter. Maybe it's third, because Avalon, which is also in the same genre, very good. And this, I think, is, contrary to the other things that we've discussed in this episode, very easy to implement into D&D. You made a offhanded mention earlier about something that I was going to circle back to, about someone having a secret motivation. That is a lot of what makes a game like Dead of Winter really good, is people are working towards a common goal, but there's this idea that someone out there might be actively trying to ruin everyone. And each player who is actually on the same team, on the side of good, on the side of surviving, has, in addition to collective survival, their own personal motivation, which they also have to fulfill in order to win the game. And that will cause them to do some things that are not necessarily in the collective best interest, to put their own needs above those of the people around them, even though they are all trying to work together. And that sort of thing can cast a lot of suspicion and make everyone suspect one another. And I love it when this is incorporated into other media. Things like other zombie movies. I want to say there's some of this in Walking Dead, but it's been a long time since I watched that. Definitely other zombie shows like Z Nation. I love Z Nation. Everyone should go and watch that if they're interested in any sort of zombie-related content. But it's so simple to add something like that into your D&D session. Give the party a goal and then discuss individual goals with the various players for their characters, and then subtly insinuate that there's a traitor amongst the group. And then just sit back and watch them start to critically evaluate every word and every action that the other players perform.
Liam O'Brien has run a handful of one-shots for the Critical Role crew, and one of them, while it wasn't perfectly styled as a horror game, really kind of wound up in that realm because of this aspect. It's called The Screw. Did you see that one?
I have not. I can't believe that I missed one. I was going to talk about some others in a minute.
When he ran The Screw, he ran it for Travis and Laura and Ashley Birch and Sam Riegel and Mary McGlynn, and I'm probably leaving somebody out, but he gave everyone the same mission and then pulled each member of the group aside individually before the game and said, but I'm giving you, and only you, a secret goal to accomplish through the course of the game. And they all had a secret goal, and they all thought they were the only one who had a secret goal. Except Sam, because he thought it'd be funny to just have Sam go in blind.
That is exactly what I'm talking about, and now I need to go and find and watch that.
It's so good.
Giving the players secondary motivations and then implying a traitor will turn them against each other. Better yet, you could have an actual traitor hidden amongst the group, and then there could be a payoff. Well, I guess it's kind of subjective whether that's better or worse than watching a bunch of people who should be working together pick each other apart for no reason. But my favorite idea is to tell each player outright that there will absolutely be a traitor in the group, and then not designate anyone.
Oh, that's mean. That's mean, Steve. Why you do this? Why you like that?
Because that's what would be fun for me as a DM is, instead of the players bonding together to stand against the DM, to do nothing to them and watch them hurt themselves. I feel like that's a great payoff. That's like a vacation for a DM.
I think the payoff would be good when you can get to the end of it all and have the lone survivor realize that they were the monster all along. That their suspicion killed everyone.
Yes, exactly. I am going to run that game at some point. I might have to wait 15 years and then do it to my children, but it will happen. But you can expand this and you can make it apply to allies in general. Although I admit that I am most excited by causing infighting amongst the party, because I am, in essence, the PvP wannabe. Get it? It's because it's a joke on your name.
You made a joke about my name.
You can do this much more safely.
Are you just going to keep doing this? You did the D&D data 3.
Yes.
Now to the PvP wannabe.
I might keep the PvP wannabe. I like that, because I do want to fight other players at some point. But you can do this.
This way like Salem, it'll happen.
Ah, he's catching on. But you can do this much more safely in, any old campaign by casting the doubt on an NPC rather than on a member of the party. Make it the party's pet NPC. Make it their favorite shopkeeper. Make it their benefactor. All these people who are supposed to be on their side. Add in a little suspicion. Is this person really trying to help us? How did this person come about all of this really convenient information for us? Gosh, they sure do seem to have come into a lot of money really suddenly. Does it seem like they're hiding something? Who are they really? What do we really know about them?
I love it when the benefactor or the patron is called into question. The person who's been having you do all of their dirty work, go on all of their missions, kill all of their enemies, and then... Wait, what were we doing? What? You had us do what? They were really who? Or just they withhold some vital piece of information that you really could have used, and you find out that they actually knew that thing. Or my favorite, you're going through these old records at the town hall, and you find an obituary just a few months old with the name of your patron just before you first met them.
Oh, that's good.
Bum, bum, bum. Who have we been working for?
Exactly. It's the subversion of expectations. You take the person that you trust the most and then have more information slowly come to light about them and their plans and the things that they've had you do until you get to the climax of the campaign and you have to question, wait, are we the bad guys now? Is this reform that we've been working to enact actually good for people that aren't them? And I enjoy toying with moral shades of gray and the fact that, what's good for one person might not be good for the others. And you can make that a very central part of your campaign very easily. But to have you question whether or not you are objectively the villains of the campaign setting is a great bait and switch.
Wouldn't that be horrible?
I would love to drop in a link to a video on YouTube where it's one of those things where a person reads someone else's D&D campaign story. It's about a party that feels like they want the DM to try something new. And so he tells them that he's going to do a horror campaign. and he has them go into this idyllic village where everyone is all smiles, and, you know, they dance up to the party members and offer them food and drinks and companionship. And when night falls, they find themselves sitting next to or across the table from or in bed with hideous aberrations that are just all limbs and gibbering mouths, long flailing tongues that are wagging all over the player characters, and how they respond to that change, and the big plot twist that the DM dropped on them, not in that one shot, but in a subsequent one shot a year later, is such a great long con. I would love to be able to share that with some people if I can find the video again.
In that case, I hope you can, because I kind of want to know that story, although I suspect I could guess where it goes. So, broad strokes, before you want to run a horror campaign, that's kind of our advice of where to start. First of all, you're gonna need your players to buy in, and there's not really a way around that. But odds are, if you're thinking about running a horror campaign, your players are probably on board. If you're like me, they're probably the ones hounding you to do it in the first place. Then you need to be careful not to discourage your players, but to continue allowing them to progress towards some kind of resolution. Quick ways to up the ante in a horror game are to preserve the mystery, to, as Steve said, and I actually like the way he put this, to show, don't name, or to name and not show, whatever the source of the horror is.
I find it strange that you have to draw attention to the fact that you agree with me about something.
No, it was just a particular turn of phrase that I enjoyed.
Yeah, I came up with that on the spot, actually. It was pretty good.
To take the things that the players and their characters are comfortable with, and to systematically remove them a bit at a time. And to take the assumptions that your players and their characters have, and remove them. Pull the rug out from under them. Make them question. And speaking of making them question, give your players' characters trust issues with themselves, with the people around them, with their fellow party members. Trust no one. Trust nothing. That is danger. That is suspense. That is drama. That is horror.
You know, D&D horror stories, and I don't mean that kind of D&D horror stories, although they are still entertaining, but D&D stories involving horrific content are some of my favorite ones to absorb. I love looking up videos about horror campaigns, and I really enjoyed Curse of Strahd when we got to play it, and I really enjoyed the couple of sessions that we did in our current campaign where horror was involved. But I haven't had as much direct experience as I want, so I live vicariously through other players. And with that in mind, listeners, tell me about your horror sessions, the ones that you ran, the ones that you participated in. Have you ever tried incorporating this into a game? What did you do? How did it go? How was it received?
How did you die?
How did they die? In all seriousness, I love hearing about other people's campaigns. And I feel like I may be in a minority there, but if you've had a great experience or a terrible one, come and tell me about it. We're going to put a link in the description of this episode to our Discord server, where I would love to come in and have a discussion about your campaigns.
And as always, if Discord isn't your bag, we're on Twitter. Feel free to stretch that word count and tell us about your horror stories. Or DM us on the platform. We can be reached at the letter B, Twinspiration.
Or send us a link on our Facebook page. You can find us on Facebook at Bardic Twinspiration. You can always reach us there to discuss this and other topics. Send me some links to follow. I have a lot of time on my hands most days at work, and would love to break up the monotony with a little audio or video of someone's dramatic foibles.
Well, it's getting to be about that time, and since Count Steve-cula turns into a pumpkin if we record for too long, we'd better start wrapping this up.
Darkness has fallen, and my appetite needs sating. I can hear the sounds of my kindred emerging from their caves and flying out into the night. As the darkness falls and the moon rises, so does my appetites.
I'm so glad you said appetites.
Until next year, insignificant mortal, I bid you farewell.
Good night and good fright.
The outro music you're listening to right now is called Mega Epic, and the intro music is called Super Epic. Both were composed by the wonderfully talented Alexander Nakarada and utilized under a Creative Commons license. You can find more of his music at serpentsoundstudios.com. If you enjoyed our content, please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and review on your listening app of choice. To keep up with us on social media, look us up on facebook.com/Bardic Twinspiration and on Twitter @BTwinspiration. Want to interact with us directly? Come join our Discord. After all, who are we if not people who are willing to roll the dice on making some new friends? Links in the description. Come check it out.
That's how you make out you're doing it wrong.
Shouldn't have done that until after recording.
I think he just shouldn't have done that. I don't know if that particular introduction was horrible or terrific or somewhere in between. Steve, what would you call something that's somewhere between horrible and terrific?
Oh, hold on.
Horrific. That's right.
Oh no, I was thinking of a joke to try to say like it sucked or something like that. I assume that you mean that it was horrific. Add a thunder sound effect or like some bats or something like that. We're gonna have to be really careful how we enunciate that word the rest of this episode. You realize that, right?
Horror. Horror.
Horror.
Hodor.
What'd you think of my accent, Rob? Did it suck?
Yeah, it bites.
Oh, there it is. That, what's a different word for encourage? Not encourages fear, but like allows fear or permits fear. Yeah.
Invites.
There you go. Good. This is what happens when I get 3 hours of sleep. I'm not about to pass out on you, but my vocabulary suffers. I'm thinking of that Jonathan Colton song right now. And then the creepy doll that always follows you. It's got a ruined eye that's always open. I love that. I love everything that Jonathan Colton does. This is why I shouldn't have beer.